No question about it. And every conversation, every show that we've ever done, I've just walked away just a little bit smarter. Some call him the beard of knowledge. That's right. Randall Carlson, master builder, architectural designer, teacher, geometrician, geomythologist, geological explorer, and renegade scholar. He has 4 decades of study and research and exploration into the interface between ancient mysteries and modern science, and has been an active Freemason for 30 years and is past master of one of the oldest and largest Masonic lodges in Georgia. Now, his work incorporates ancient mythology, astronomy, earth science, paleontology, symbolism, sacred geometry, architecture, geomancy, and other arcane and scientific traditions. For over 25 years, he has presented classes, lectures, and multimedia programs synthesizing this information for the students of the mysteries. And, of course, he will be presenting and teaching at our Soul Tech 2.0 in Loveland, Colorado. And I would like to welcome back to Fade to Black, the Beard of Knowledge, Randall Carlson. Randall, good evening.
Well, thanks for having me back, Jimmy.
You know, Randall, there are voices that I hear once in a while that just relax me and take me into that zone. You know, you've got that gift. You've got that gift.
Yeah, well, let's just head into the zone then for a couple hours.
Yeah, let's do that. And have you? Let's take me back for a second. Have you always had that gift? Let's go back to when you were like 5 years old and you're hanging out with your friends. Were you? Well, you didn't have a beard, but were you that guy? You know, growing up too.
I think I became that guy at 7.
Tell me about it. How did you figure it out?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with where we lived at the time, and also the fact that I just had parents and grandparents that encouraged an interest in many things. We lived in rural Minnesota. We had land on the edge of a lake, which was one of these leftover puddles from the Great Ice Age, and living there until I was 9 years old, pretty much, and just becoming, how can I say it, sort of just becoming very much enchanted with this landscape. I actually then moved away for a couple of 2.5 years, but then came back and then continued living in the same area, on the same lake, in a different house, but right up until I was 16. So then spent most of my first 16 years living there in this environment in rural Minnesota, and you know, I remember early on learning about the Great Ice Age and being really fascinated by that. And I couldn't have been 7 or 8 years old at that point, I guess.
You mentioned your parents and your grandparents, which is always, you know, the guidance that sets you on your path for life. We all go through that, no matter what. If it's a good relationship or a bad one, it sets you on your path. So when you say that they encourage these things, were they cool? Were they reading Blavatsky? You know, I don't know. I mean, what?
Well, not quite. But my father, he was he was basically, he was a carpenter and a master carpenter, as was his dad. So I grew up, when I was a kid, they had Carlson and Son home builders, and it would be the two of them, and they would build a house, pretty much do almost everything, and then sell the house, and then build another one and sell that. So, you know, being around building, I'm sure had an influence because, you know, building, your building is all about geometry, right? It's all about processes. So that was a big part of it, but also the fact that my dad was a rather interesting fellow. He, you know, he had no college, but he was a very smart man, and he was interested in a lot of things. So we had books around the house about yoga, about martial arts, about shamanism, and this, you know, we're talking about the 1950s. So I remember a book that he had was about Australian shamanism, and it was talking about their various practices, and that was very early. I guess 9 years old was by the time I had learned how to read. I was very intrigued by those kind of books. It was him that first told me about. He said, well, there used to be a big ice sheet here, or a big ice cap where we live, and it covered all the land, and it was, thousands of feet thick, and when it melted away, that's why there's so many lakes around here, and which is, exactly why there are so many lakes in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so I think living in an environment where everything, every hill, every hollow, every ridge, every lake, everything had been shaped by the presence of these great ice sheets, and then the melting of these great ice sheets. Now, you don't really understand that. You don't consciously are aware of it. But growing up, and by the time we got 16, me and my brothers and my friends from around, we rambled over that land for miles. I mean, and it was all privately owned land, but people didn't care. I mean, we were out. We usually hardly ever even saw anyone. Sometimes we'd just be out. We had canoes, so we lived on one end of the lake. We could paddle up to the other end of the lake, Schmidt Lake. A short portage over, we were at Bass Lake. Then we could paddle our canoes across Bass Lake. A short portage from there was Eagle Lake. We could paddle our canoes across there. We could spend all day out, taking our canoes. And so, this was the kind of things we were doing as boys at 10 years old, 11, 12 years old. Then, our nearest neighbors were all farmers. So I had my best friend was a youngest boy in a farm family with 10 kids. And we were the same age. We grew up together. So early on, I'd play on the farm, and then by the time I think I turned 12 or 13, then I started working on the farm. And so doing farm work, I think, was an important component of, seeing how things work in the real world, as opposed to the way they might work in an urban environment where everything is regimented and, it's all about social climbing and this and that. When you're out on the farm, it is what it is. I mean, we'd be out, we'd find a carcass of a calf, for example.
Right.
We didn't know what maybe got the calf, but it might have been coyotes. And then you'd see over a period of weeks the carcass. We'd be out there hiking around, walking around, whatever. We'd see the carcass of this calf, and then after several weeks it had decayed, and then after a month or two it would be a skeleton out there, and then the following year we'd go out and go, there'd be no trace left of that animal. And so, seeing things like that, later on I would think back to that often when I'm studying things, 30 years later, things like taphonomy, which is the study of fossilization and how an animal, what happens to an animal between the time it dies and the time it becomes a fossil. How does that process occur? Of course, there's multiple processes, but in nature, what usually happens is that some creature dies and its constituent components get completely recycled, just like this remains of this calf that we would have found out in the field.
Right.
By the following season or the end of the summer, even, there's nothing left. See, there's nothing there to become a fossil. So a lot of, I think, was just being in an environment like that. We had winter, the lake would freeze over, of course, and then my grandfather would put an ice house out on the ice, auger a hole through it so I could go out there and sit with him and we'd catch fish. In the summer, I would sit on a log that had fallen over, a tree had fallen over the lake, and I would sit out there with my fishing pole and catch fish, and we would have cookouts in our backyard. And then the farm where my best buddy lived, they boarded horses. So once I hit about 12, 13 years old and I started working on the farm, the main reason I worked was because after the pay, I think we maybe got 80 cents an hour, if that.
Right.
For hard, brutal work of hauling in hundreds of hay bales and that kind of stuff. But the reason I did it was so we could saddle up the horses after work and go riding.
Man, you had it going on. I mean, as a kid, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and of course, to me, that was just hey, this is the way it is. I took it for granted. I thought this is how everybody lived, and it was only later, years later, I look back and I go, God, I was really lucky to have that kind of a situation. And I was, we had, my mother had this huge garden. So, she was constantly, we were eating home, stuff we'd grown ourselves. We got most of our eggs and meat and cheese from farms within a mile or two of where we lived. So, I mean, this is in the 1950s. And but then my parents couldn't make it work for whatever reason. So 1960, they split up. They got divorced, and my mother moved me and my three brothers with her back home where she was from, which was small town Louisiana. So that was quite a different environment. But looking back now, I realize that now having the chance to spend 2.5 years, for now instead of canoeing up in a Minnesota lake, we're poling John boats through the bayous for 2.5 years there. So it was just this contrast. I think it was the fact that there was so much rural dimension to my growing up. Okay, now couple that with the fact that both my mother and my dad's mother both loved to read, so there were books. And I guess I was 9 years old. For my Christmas or birthday present, I get a subscription to All About Books. I don't know if you remember.
Oh, yeah. I do remember that.
Every month I'd get a new All About book. It'd be all about electricity, all about fossils,
right.
All about the weather. And I just really early on got very, very interested in science. I think.
Well, let me jump in for 1 second, because you said something that had to affect you when your grandfather or your father turns to you and says, you're not 7, 8, 9 years old, and says, there was a few thousand feet of ice above our heads at one point.
Mm-hmm.
That, because you can't grasp it really how intense that is, but a few thousand feet might as well be 10 miles in your mind, right?
Yeah.
You're picturing that. But this is
at that age too.
At that age, and to put it into context here, imagine the Sears Tower in Chicago with another 1,000 feet of ice above it, right?
Yeah.
or Manhattan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Completely with another 1,000 feet on top of that or more. That's mm-hmm. what was going on back then, and that will change you. It changed me the first time I heard it.
Yeah. Well, here I am, 60 years later, and I'm remembering that. Of course, the memory has faded from, what it was. As you get older, it's kind of like maybe an old movie reel or something. It just gets worn and more worn. But I have these snapshot memories, and one of them is my dad telling me about that. There had been ice there, and we had a book. It might have been a book on geography. It seemed like it was a book on geography, and in there, looking at it, it had pictures. And in retrospect, I think the pictures were actually pictures of the Little Ice Age, because there were a lot of these woodcuts and sketches and paintings made, particularly during the 17 and 1800s,
mm-hmm.
when all the glaciers were growing so massively throughout the Alps and really around the world.
Right.
And the glaciers came down and swallowed up the farms in many cases. They moved into valleys. And we had this book that had some of those pictures in it. In retrospect, I'm thinking, well, if it was two different things. We're talking about the Great Ice Age, when Minnesota was half covered in ice. We're going back 10 to 15,000 years ago. Little Ice Age, we're going back 200 years ago. But it still made that same impression on me. I had now a visual in my mind, seeing that picture in that geography book of these big glaciers. I actually remember it was kind of unnerving. It was a little bit. It was almost like, maybe a sort of a dark thing rather than just, now it's at some point it becomes, wow, this is awesome. But it was kind of awful in a way to think about that, as to a little kid, thinking about, wow, you know. And of course, you don't have a framework. You don't understand, you know, too much the difference between 10,000 years and 10 million years.
Right. Might as well be the same thing. What about the other?
Might as well be.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just interrupted you, but
no, go ahead.
What about Minnesota's a very, very fascinating state, as is, you know, the Upper Peninsula and Wisconsin and the Dakotas and Montana. Very fascinating areas, but Minnesota has got a lot of fringe things going on there, like the Kensington Ruin Stone and some of the ancient discoveries that have been found there. Did you know about any of that growing up?
Oh, of course, you know, we'd all, I think, heard about the Kensington Ruin Stone. Although my memory of it then was that I certainly remember hearing about it early on, probably in grade school.
Right.
But I think the dominant opinion at the time was that it was a more recent hoax. Whereas I think now, you know, I think they're willing to concede that, yeah, it really is, 500 or 600 years old anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, or maybe even older.
Right.
I'm not quite up to speed on the latest research on the Kensington Runestone. I know that, what's his name? We know
Scott Walter. Yeah, Scott.
Scott Walter. Yeah, he would be the man to ask on that.
Oh yeah, we talk to Scott all the time. He was on with us last week. But I recently saw I found a documentary. This is no joke. I can't even believe it. This was 6 months ago. I'll find the link. I'll find out what it was, and I'll get it to you. It was literally a documentary from the 70s. You know, square frame, right? 3:4 ratio, right? Documentary of ancient artifacts from Minnesota. Right? Yeah, it was crazy. I had no idea. Of course, they covered the Kensington Ruin Stone, but there was stuff being dug up every, you know, town and homestead and home site and things, stuff that were being dug up all over Minnesota, and I had no idea. And they traveled to a couple of museums and little, you know, backwoods museums and going in these back rooms and revealing these different artifacts. And it was pretty nutty to see. One of them, I want to get this right. There was very small. I want to say it was like slate and maybe 1.5 inches by 1 inches, a little like a pendant with ancient Hebrew 10 Commandments. Right? Dug up in Minnesota. Yeah. and I saw this documentary. I'll get you that. But that
yeah, it reminds me of the old Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention song. Who could imagine that they would freak out in Minnesota was the line of the song.
Yep.
And here I was 16 listening to Frank Zappa, and I'm going, hey, well, at least I think one of us is freaking out.
Yes. Yeah. Are you talking about the first album, Freak Out?
The first album, yeah.
Oh,
the very first. How many people know about Freak Out, the first Mothers of Invention album?
I still listen to it to this day. And that was 1960. I'm going to go 8. I'm going to say 68. Maybe before.
I'm going to go 67.
Yeah, might even be before that. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, you know, here's how much I used to listen to it. Well, I'm about to get upset from watching my TV and checking out the news until my eyeballs fail to see. I mean, to say that every day is just another rotten myth. And when it's going to change, my friend, is anybody's guess. So I'm wishing and I'm praying and I'm hoping for the best. Each time I hear him saying that, there's no way to delay that trouble coming every day. And I could go on, but I won't. But see, I
do it all the time.
remember that from 1967.
Yeah,
Jimmy.
You ready?
That's how religiously I listened to it.
June 27th, 1966. Holy crap.
Okay.
66.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
I didn't get it till the following. Yeah, I bought that in the summer of '67. That's when I bought it.
I can tell you right now, and Frank Zappa's had this effect on anybody that's a Frank Zappa fan. Pretty much, I could recite Any album that I was a fan of, going back to the mid-'70s of Frank Zappa, I can recite word for word every song on every album. Right? I can do it. I can do it.
See,
no
I believe
problem.
it.
Yeah, no problem. I do it all the time. See, that's why I knew you were cool. You just that was the big reveal right there. Now, let's get this set up for when we return. At what point did you take the right-hand turn where you went, okay, all right, this crap ain't right. We're being fed a big bowl of fruit and nuts here. What happened? What tipped the scales?
That happened between the ages of 16 and 18, clearly. At 16, we had been living out by the lake there in rural Minnesota. It's summer of 1967. My mother's still living in Louisiana. She has now gone to work for WBRZ Television in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which was, I think, the second largest television station. One of her duties, one of her jobs at the station was she set up, I'm sure what they call this job, but whenever entertainers or celebrities or bands or anything would come to town, she was responsible for setting up their venues a lot, the booking the hotel rooms, the limousines, all of this kind of stuff. So she had this pretty glamorous job, right? Now, I'd been living out in rural Minnesota, so other than the 2.5 years I was in small town Louisiana, I'm still living out there. I'm a pretty dumb, naive country boy, 16. You go to visit my mother, summer of 67. So first thing that happens is we start partying with The Who and Herman's Hermits and Blues Magoos and these bands that are coming to town, and I'm thinking, this is really cool. So we decide we're going to stay there and live. So me and my two younger brothers, who were my dad's boys, we move in with my mom. She has actually an apartment. She buys a house. We move into a kind of a swanky subdivision of Baton Rouge. We start school, and very first day of school, it just started going downhill. I got sent home. My mother, a couple of days before school, my mother had taken me and gotten this expensive, of course my hair had kind of gotten bushy over the summer. She took me and got this, expensive razor haircut stuff. First day of school, I get sent home because they send me, my homeroom teacher sends me to the office. So they go down there. They had 2 fingers above my eyebrows. My hair, it's touching your ears and it's touching your collar and back. So I got sent home from school the first day. So it went downhill from there. And I became very rebellious against what I saw as this kind of oppressive authoritarian system of idiots that were like pretty much thought they had it all figured out. And it just, it was great until the day school started. So I managed to get through most of that year, but by the end of the year, I couldn't stand even a minute in that school. So I started skipping school, getting in trouble, and I got in a lot of trouble the last few months, early 68 and this, and so did my brothers, and we all got in so much trouble. Like one of my brothers got in so much trouble that he went to court and he was told he would go to, I guess, reform school for however long, or he could leave the state. So
wow.
We came back 1 year down there. I then moved back to Minnesota. And in the interim, my grandmother had passed away, who I was very close to. And in fact, it happened that summer of 67. We had come down there, and it was just a few weeks before school started, actually, when the news came that she had passed away. So I had this and I was very close to my grandmother. And so I had this kind of what would you say? I was grieving. I was internalizing this grieving. So I had this going on psychologically and emotionally when I went to this new school environment. So the second day, I guess it was a school, I'm going from one class to another, and I get surrounded by a group of the local, whatever. They were, the cool guys of the school, and they surrounded me, about 5 or 6 of them, to tell me how much they didn't like guys like me. So I kind of became an outcast for that year that I was down there. Gotten a lot. The people I started hanging out with were were not the good boys, the exemplary ones. They were the troublemakers. So after a year of that, I came back to Minnesota, and I had an attitude. I had really, within that year, developed this anti-authoritarian attitude. But once I got back to Minnesota, I kind of calmed down a little bit. The last 3 or 4 months that I was living there in Baton Rouge, I was really blown out at both ends. And if I had kept doing that, I don't know where I would have ended up, carousing and partying and drinking and smoking and doing all these kind of things. Came back to Minnesota, and I just calmed down. And then that fall of 68, I started hanging out with, went down to this place in Minneapolis called the West Bank. And the West Bank was like the Haight-Ashbury of the Midwest.
Okay, let me jump in right there. That's a perfect spot. I got to take a break, and let's do it now. And West Bank, let me get that down, because that's where we're picking up when we come back. Our guest tonight, Randall Carlson. We're going to do it all tonight. We got a lot to cover. It's going to be a great conversation. Stay with us. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. This is Fade to Black. More with Randall after this short break. Stay with us. You're listening to a preview of Fade to Black. To get the full episode, go to jimmychurchradio.com and get our podcast. Click on the podcast banner or sign up in the membership area for downloadable MP3s. Everything commercial free. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Randall Carlson is here. Buckle up, kiddies. It is going to be one of those conversations, and I always enjoy it when Randall is here. And right before the break, Randall, you brought up West Bank, the Haight-Ashbury of Minnesota. Now, if you're going to go and start to figure things out about life, I would say that the West Bank is the place to be.
Well, yeah, over the break I was thinking, God, maybe I shouldn't have gone there. That might be a little too controversial.
Not at all.
But what the heck?
Yeah, not at all. Heck? Not at all. Not at all. Well, see, the thing is, it's you. It's part of you. When I went to San Francisco the first time, you know what I did? I didn't want to see the Golden Gate Bridge. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to see whatever, the hill, the winding streets. No, I went straight to the Haight-Ashbury sign and took a picture under it. They cross, right? Haight and Ashbury. That's all I wanted. And that's all I wanted to do. And I did it.
And you damn did it.
That's it. So I'm with you on that. I'm with you. And so... were you starting to research? Were you starting to get into this?
Yeah. Well, I'll back up a year. When that school, that first day of school in Baton Rouge, there was another boy in my homeroom who was also his first day of that school. He and his mother, his divorced mother, like was with my divorced mother, right? He had just moved from California, just moved from L.A. So that first day, he and I got sent home. So we both actually got sent down to the office by our homeroom teacher. So right there, we bonded over that. See, now he had just moved from L.A., and of course he had managed to get in the scene out there, and so he was constantly telling me about the virtues of the psychedelic experience and all of this kind of thing. So he was my best friend for that year that I was down there. Mm-hmm. Is it okay to talk about that subject?
Oh, yeah,
good.
Absolutely.
Good. Absolutely right. Good. Okay. My kind of man. All right. So anyways, I haven't done anything. I'm totally innocent. I had tried my first puff of marijuana early 68. He had gotten some. I tried again. It did absolutely nothing for me. So I said, well, I guess I'm immune. And that was my attitude. This stuff doesn't work on me. So I had just kind of lost interest in it. And then, so it's now fall. I'm back in Minnesota. My grandmother has passed away the previous summer. There was a recession that pretty much killed my dad and my grandpa's business for a few years. So in order to get through that, my dad sold the house we'd been living in. And he and his new wife and their young son, my half-brother, had moved into my grandparents' house, right? My grandfather was living there in the basement. My grandmother was gone, so it was just my grandfather alone. Me and my two brothers came back. We're all living in this little house in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. And I go back to high school. I'm in my senior year of high school, back to the same high school that I had gone in my sophomore year. But I'm now making up because I've pretty much blown my junior year completely. I can still remember my getting my final report card was 5 F's and a B, and the B was for phys ed. So you can see academically I pretty much was a complete washout.
Right.
So I came back and I thought, okay, I'm going to do better. I'm going to make up for this bad year, and I took kind of an extra course or two. So come spring of '69, when I would have normally graduated, I was 2 credits short, so I didn't get a diploma. I actually ended up going back, in 1973, taking a 2-month program, taking math, actually, because I loved math, and my high school awarded me a diploma from, so I get, over the years, I've regularly gotten contacted for, class reunions for class of 1973, which, of course, was 4 years behind me. But anyways, I'm back in high school now. I'm 17, and at this point now I'm becoming aware of the Vietnam War because my older brother has gone into the Air Force. I've got a couple of friends that I've grown up with, guys that I know that are a year or two older than me. They're over. They've been drafted. My best friend, the farm boy that I grew up with, his older brother was over in Vietnam. So up until this point, I've been pretty much oblivious to what was going on. It was just something on the other side of the world that didn't involve me. As a kid, that's kind of how you get through that stuff. In my teenage years, I was more interested, at 15 and 16, the things I was interested in, which mostly, I guess, at that point was girls, kept me distracted. I didn't pay any attention to the Vietnam War. Now I'm back in Minnesota, and suddenly, it's 68, and that's the big year. That's the Tet Offensive, and where things really began to go crazy over there. That was when the demonstrations really began in earnest. It was, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the riots at the Democratic Convention. So, all of this stuff is going on, and I'm 17, and I'm really just now becoming aware of all of this and realizing, oh my gosh, the things that are going on out there in the world are going to affect me directly, whether I like it or not, apparently.
Yeah, the contrast between growing up in a rural area and not, your world is, the forest and the lakes and your home.
Yeah.
And now we have riots in Detroit and Los Angeles and in Chicago at the convention, and assassinations and this brutal war going on in Vietnam, and the activism that was going across this nation with your generation. And you start to realize at that point that the world is not what it seems, right?
Exactly. And so there's these two contrasting things going on. On the one hand, there's the war, the ever-present war. It got to the point where, it was like this black cloud hanging over you every day. Whereas up until, I guess, I would say that summer of '68, when I moved back from Baton Rouge, is when I really, started realizing, thinking about, oh, yeah, there is a war going on, and it's getting bigger. And I'm knowing people now that are getting sucked into it, getting drafted and being sent over there. And then I had, I guess, let's see, I won't give the whole name. His name was Tom. I knew these two brothers. They were living on a neighboring farm. I'd ridden the school bus with them for years. I think the youngest brother was a year younger than me, and the older brother was a year older. Tom was a year older. And so he got drafted. And I wasn't good friends with him, but I'd known him. He was a nice kid. I'd known him for years. We'd kind of, known each other since literally from first grade up through high school, right? So he went off. He became a gunner in a helicopter. So I saw, now it's gotten vague who it was. I think it was his younger brother, but no, probably not his younger brother, somebody that was a mutual friend. And I said something about, well, what's Tom? Is Tom back from Vietnam? And said, well, yeah, he got sent back. They got shot down and he was killed. And then he went on and said, and they sent, I heard from his brother that the remains they sent back would have barely filled a shoebox. And that was just really shocking to me. That was very shocking to me to hear that, this kid, and thinking about what had happened to him. I remember that was kind of a turning point for me, where I really started going, what the hell is going on here, And so it's fall of '68 now, and I'm thinking about a lot of things, and I was a fervent reader. I read all the time, and the Life magazine had come out, or was it Look? One of the two had come out and had done a feature article on LSD, and, it was actually probably a few years older before LSD became demonized, as it was really during the Nixon years, when they were still thinking that LSD was going to be a very positive psychological tool.
Right.
And I remember reading about that, and then my friend in Baton Rouge had done it about a dozen times, so he was constantly talking about the experience and how incredible it was and this and that. So I just decided I wanted to find out more, so I started going down to the West Bank, which meant the West Bank of the Mississippi River. Now, the University of Minnesota is on the East Bank. The West Bank was kind of a bohemian area. It's also called the Cedar Riverside area. And it had one time been settled by the Scandinavians. So when I was a kid, I can remember my grandfather, who was an immigrant from Sweden, came over when he was 16 years old on a cattle boat, riding with the cattle, right? So that was my grandfather that was the carpenter that worked with my father. And I remember him referring to it, and they used to call it Snooze Boulevard. And this was where all the Swedes and the Scandinavians lived. But by the 60s, it had metamorphosed into this bohemian area. It had a lot of coffee shops and art houses and cafes, and it was kind of where all of the, sort of the bohemian crowd, the Beats, hung out there. Some of Bob Dylan's first public gigs were in the Cedar Riverside area. There was a whole music scene, and then of course, 66 to 68, you could go down the street just like you could almost, in any big major city, and it's like an open air market. There was like 2 blocks. It was literally like an open air market. You could eat anything you want for the most part, right?
Yeah.
So I got to know some people down there, and I pretty much, before I knew it, I was part of that whole scene, for the next year, and I experimented a whole lot. The following summer, which was the summer of '69, was pretty much when I terminated, because at that point, even though I'd had nothing but good experiences, there was some really strange stuff showing up. And how that stuff got there, interesting question. The word on the street was that it was deliberately being put out there, that the Nixon administration, of course, who started the DEA and launched the drug war, he was trying to, show how evil these drugs were. But the statistics weren't really supporting it. So there was actually, I've read several things. It's been years, but whether it's true or not, I don't know. But it was certainly the speculation that there was really bizarre, strange stuff being dumped deliberately on the street so that people would freak out and there would be more emergency room calls, and because there's some really weird stuff showed up. And at that point is when I decided I didn't know what I was getting anymore. So, I at one point I was second in line to Sandoz Laboratories, third in line, it's Sandoz Laboratories. So that was the source, and then that source ended. So kind of my experimentation was fall of '68 to the fall of '69. And then I quit because, you didn't know what you were getting anymore. It became too risky. But in that interim, I felt like, and I also did a lot of peyote. I'll admit that too. I did that about a dozen times, and I would do it. I discovered that if you went out into nature, that was really the place to do it.
Right.
And it opened my eye. I mean, I'll have to say that summer of '69 having these experiences out. We would go camping in western Minnesota, for example, or go up. There's a place we used to go called it was the St. Croix, along the St. Croix River. Now, the St. Croix River forms the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin for pretty good ways, maybe 100 miles or so, and it's got its head. The head of the St. Croix River is almost up to the southern terminus of Lake Superior. Now, where we used to go, even as kids, we used to go there. Our dad and I'd go up there with my dad and with my grandparents sometimes. There's a place called St. Croix Falls. And in this, what it is, it's a basalt bedrock outcrop along the river. And along the shelf, which is maybe anywhere from 50 to 100 feet, there's a basalt shelf on the west side of the river there. And in that basalt shelf are these gigantic potholes. Some of them are 20 feet wide and 80 feet deep, round circular holes that have been drilled into the bedrock, right? And in fact, when I was guiding Graham Hancock across the Pacific Northwest, we ended in Minnesota at Minneapolis for the Paradigm Symposium. But the last site, what I did was I took Graham on, we visited dozens of sites so that he could understand the catastrophist geology that he was writing about in Magicians of the Gods. Our last field stop was these potholes on the St. Croix River. And I have some really I was down inside one of the potholes. I've got a really great picture of Graham peering over the rim down into this, the one I mean is probably 40 feet deep. But so I had gone there as a kid frequently, and I would certainly have to say that pothole, those potholes there, were very intriguing to me. And I remember my grandmother telling me that there had been, that they had been eroded by water, lots of water, And so, of course, now I understand that, yes, what happened there, it's a constriction in the bedrock, and you had this tremendous meltwater flood discharging off of what's called the superior lobe of the Laurentide ice sheet. So when the ice was melting back catastrophically, these huge meltwater floods came down and essentially cut the canyon that is now the modern pathway of the St. Croix River. So that was one of the places I used to go to do my experiences. Or camping out on the prairie of western Minnesota was another one. And so being out there and there was one in 1969 where we were, doing some really nice stuff, and we had set up our tents. We were going to camp out on this ridge in a place called Pipestone, which is refers to the stone that the Plains Indians would quarry to make their peace pipes out of. And this area where we were camping was always considered to be sacred land, and even warring tribes, when they were there extracting this red clay stone to use for their peace pipes, recognized the sanctity of this area and wouldn't engage in any violent or aggressive acts there. So we were camping there, and this storm front came up, and right in the middle of this tripping on this stuff, was in what turned out to be the most ferocious storm of the decade, according to a park ranger we talked to next morning. So coming through that, it was just like this experience of the raw power of nature.
Right.
And I became so, just obsessed with this, really, how the world worked, how the natural world worked, how phenomenal and how miraculous and how profound the whole system is. That summer of '69 is where I totally came away with these experiences, convinced that there was something major to understand about this world in which we live, that there's a mystery. Everything about it became mysterious to me. And since then, I've been obsessed with curiosity about what is and of course, I can look back now and I can remember, like, for example, there was a hill where we lived there. There was a hill to our east where I could go up on this hill, and it gave me a very panoramic perspective of the land for miles around. And there would be times I remember going up there and sitting up there, and it was mostly overgrown with alfalfa. And some summers, the alfalfa might be 18 inches deep and green and cool. And I would sit up on this hill and watch the weather systems coming in from the west, these great armadas of cumulus clouds coming over, and you could see the shadows of, you've probably seen this and know what I'm talking about, the shadows of the clouds are running over the landscape, doing their best to keep up with this armada of clouds that are sailing overhead.
Right.
And I would sit, and the wind would blow, and it would create, in the alfalfa, it would be like waves. How can I describe it? It looked like waves, green waves, sweeping across the fields of alfalfa. And, of course, you know, I'm 12, 13, 14 years old, and just completely high, just completely enraptured with this whole experience. And as I'm looking out, I can still remember this sense, that I couldn't put my finger on, that I couldn't describe, but a sense that there was a mystery or a meaning in this landscape, that there was meaning. It wasn't just a hill, a random hill or a random hollow.
Tree. Right.
Right. It was there was a meaning there. It was like, it would be maybe somebody like who didn't know how to read, who was illiterate, but looking at a book and going, I know there's meaning there. I just can't decipher it.
Right.
You see. So somewhere along the line, that idea, that way of thinking about the world, just it became part of my psychology, and I've been that way ever since. Obsessed with understanding the hidden meaning of this world. I guess that's the only way I can put it.
And let's set this up for when we come back. What was the, because I have my memories of this, and I still stand by them. What was like the turning point fact, from a book or from a researcher where you went, okay, all right, here we go. One thing. Do you remember what that was?
Well, I would say if we jump forward now 1 year, summer of 70.
Right.
I spent most of that summer really the better part of 4 months just traveling around the western part of the United States. Spent a lot of time in Colorado, but I hitchhiked, hiked, rode with a buddy for a while, and went through Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Washington, Montana, parts of Oregon. So, and with a backpack. So I spent about 4 months with a backpack, going around and sleeping out by the side of mountain creeks and up, on mountainsides. Spent about 2 to 3 weeks up, right, almost camped out on the Continental Divide, right up at the foot of Mount Audubon. And so that definitely had made a major impression on me. In terms of this sense that I had that there was some kind of a hidden meaning to the world, really gelled that summer and spending that time, out there. I slept out pretty much under the stars every night for those 4 months, and then would wake up and, I spent a week in the Black Hills of South Dakota camping out, went out to Olympic Peninsula and stayed out there for 4 or 5 days camping on the peninsula, in Montana, in Washington. And I think the one thing that really left a big impression on me, something that really instigated this sense that there was some meaning that needed to be extracted from the landscape, was taking this, with a friend of mine at that point who had joined me in my travels, and he had a Dodge van, and we were driving through the Columbia Gorge that forms the border between Washington and Oregon. I don't know if you've ever made that drive through the Columbia Gorge.
I have.
You know how spectacular, impressive it is, how massive the gorge is, and when you see these tributaries coming in, and there are these massive delta terraces built out from the mouths of the tributaries that that really impressed me. Like, what is this? So that summer of 70 and spending those 4 months is sort of what clinched everything for me. From that point on, I began reading whatever I could get my hands on that would tell me more about that. And so I was led into, of course, I'm sure you and a lot of your listeners have heard of Immanuel Velikovsky. his work was available in the early 70s. So I remember reading him, and, you know, at that point, you know, one of the things that he did was he began to integrate catastrophism, geological catastrophism, paleontological catastrophism with mythology, right? That was kind of what he did. Now, he's been really criticized by, you know, mainstream scientists. And, you know, what he was doing back in the 50s, he was laboring under the limited amount of knowledge we had at that point.
Yeah, we need to take a break right here, but what we knew and understood about the universe and the solar system compared to today was limited.
Yes.
But his outlook on orbits and worlds and how we got here was absolutely, without a doubt, revolutionary. And it caused, Randall, in my opinion, it caused us to ask questions. And that's what we're going to do when we come back. Let's continue this conversation. Absolutely amazing. This is Fade to Black. Our guest tonight, Randall Carlson. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Stay with us. You have just listened to a full hour free preview of Fade to Black. To get the full show, all archives, just go to our podcast section at jimmychurchradio.com. You can also sign up to be a Fadernaut in our membership area, where we have downloadable MP3s. Go to jimmychurchradio.com. Go Bagley Tappy.